The heavy scent of lilies filled the hallway, a fragrance I usually associated with celebrations, but that evening it smelled like a funeral. I was standing in the foyer of our home, still wearing my coat, holding a bottle of vintage champagne I'd bought to celebrate my promotion, when Mark stepped out of the shadows of the living room with a look of clinical detachment I had never seen before. Without a word, he placed a thick manila envelope on the console table, right next to my car keys, and checked his watch as if he had a more important meeting to attend. "I've filed for divorce, Elena, and don't bother arguing about the new apartment. My lawyer says it's marital property, and I expect my 50% by the end of the month," he said, his voice as sharp and cold as a scalpel. He stood there, smug and certain, completely unaware that the very foundation of his greed was built on a legal void he hadn't even bothered to investigate. For 7 years, our life had been a masterpiece of carefully curated normalcy. We were the couple people envied, the successful corporate architect and the meticulous forensic accountant. Our mornings were a synchronized dance of grinding coffee beans, the steam from our mugs rising in the soft morning light of a kitchen that always smelled of cinnamon and expensive roast. Mark would kiss my forehead before leaving, his hand lingering on my waist just long enough to make me feel secure, while I would straighten his tie and tell him to have a productive day. We had our rituals: Sunday brunches at the bistro on the corner, Friday night movies with homemade popcorn, and the way we'd plan our future while lying in the dark, whispering about the children we'd eventually have and the home we'd build together. Mark was charming, the kind of man who could command a room with a single smile, but there were always thin, almost invisible cracks in the porcelain. He had a way of making my achievements feel like our achievements, while his successes were strictly his own. When I got a raise, he'd suggest we upgrade his car because it was better for our image. When I received a bonus, his mother, Lyudmila, would suddenly need a new hip or a renovation for her dacha. Lyudmila was a woman who mastered the art of the suffering saint. She would sit at our dinner table, picking at her food with a sigh, and talk about how hard it was for a widow to maintain a household on a meager pension. "Markusha is such a good son," she would say, patting his hand while pointedly avoiding my gaze. "He understands that family is a circle, Elena. Everything inside the circle belongs to everyone. That's how we were raised." I would smile and nod, despite the tightening in my chest. I didn't mind helping, but I began to notice that the circle only seemed to flow in one direction, out of my savings account and into their desires. Mark would often look at me with a playful, yet manipulative pout. "Lenechka, it's just money. We're a team, right? What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." It sounded romantic until I realized I was the only one contributing to the ours part of the equation. The turning point came 2 years ago when my great-aunt Vera passed away. She was a formidable woman who had never married and spent her life investing in real estate with the precision of a chess grandmaster. She left me a significant inheritance, but more importantly, she left it with a very specific set of instructions. Vera knew the men in our family history. She knew how they tended to view a woman's wealth as a communal buffet. She had set up a private trust, and the funds were transferred into an account that I kept entirely separate from our joint household budget. When I told Mark about the inheritance, his eyes lit up with a predatory spark that made my blood run cold for a split second. "We can finally buy that penthouse in the city center," he had exclaimed, already pulling up real estate listings on his iPad. "Think of the equity, Elena. It'll be our legacy." I watched him that night, his finger sliding across the screen, picking out marble countertops and designer light fixtures, and I felt a sudden, sharp instinct to protect myself. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. I simply told him I was looking into the best way to invest it. Over the next year, the quiet life began to shift. Mark became increasingly obsessed with the idea of the new apartment. He stopped contributing to our joint savings, claiming his firm was restructuring his commission schedule. Meanwhile, Ludmila's demands grew more frequent and more expensive. She needed a new heating system. She needed a therapeutic cruise to the Mediterranean. She needed a designer wardrobe for her new social circle. I watched the money disappear from Mark's accounts, while I quietly executed my own plan. I found a stunning three-bedroom apartment in a historic building, high ceilings, crown molding, and windows that looked out over the park. I purchased it using the funds from Vera's trust, ensuring every document was stamped, notarized, and filed under a legal clause that kept it as my sole, non-marital property. I didn't hide the purchase, but I didn't emphasize the legal specifics to Mark. I let him believe what he wanted to believe, that I was buying our future home. "It's the perfect investment for us, Mark," I told him one evening as we stood in the empty living room of the new place, the sunset painting the walls in hues of gold and amber. "Finally," he breathed, running his hand along the fireplace mantel. "We've finally made it. I can't wait to move in. Mother will be so proud of what we've built." He didn't notice that I didn't use the word "we" when I signed the final closing papers. He was too busy bragging to his colleagues about his new acquisition. The cracks in our marriage were no longer thin. They were becoming canyons. He started staying out late, his phone always face down on the nightstand. When I asked him about work, he'd snap at me, telling me I was being suffocating and controlling. The warmth in our house evaporated, replaced by a chilling silence that was only broken by the sound of him whispering on the balcony late at night. I knew he was talking to Ludmilla, and I knew they were planning something. I could feel the betrayal vibrating in the air, like the hum of a downed power line. I waited, my forensic mind documenting every shift in his behavior, every missing dollar from our joint account, and every lie he told about his whereabouts. I was waiting for the moment the mask would finally slip, but I never expected him to drop it with such arrogant confidence, thinking he had already won the prize before the game had even truly begun. The atmosphere in our home didn't just turn cold, it became sterile, like a hospital room where someone was waiting for a long-expected death. Mark stopped looking me in the eye. The man who once couldn't sit on the sofa without his arm draped over my shoulders now occupied the far edge of the furniture, his body angled away from me as if I were a source of contagion. He began taking urgent calls in the bathroom with the shower running, the muffled drone of his voice vibrating through the tiles while I sat in the bedroom, staring at the wall, my heart hammering a slow, rhythmic warning against my ribs. Ludmilla's visits became more frequent and strangely focused. She no longer complained about her hip. Instead, she developed an intense interest in the logistics of our new life. One Tuesday afternoon, she let herself in with her spare key and found me in the kitchen. She didn't offer a greeting. She just stood there, smoothing the front of her expensive wool coat, a gift I had paid for, and gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "Markusha tells me the renovation on the new apartment is nearly finished," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern. "It's a lot for a young woman to manage, Elena. The paperwork, the taxes, the title deeds. It's all so complicated. Mark mentioned he was going to take over the legal filings to save you the headache. He's so protective of you." I felt a prickle of ice crawl down my spine. "The paperwork is already handled, Ludmilla. My lawyer and I took care of it months ago. There's no need for Mark to worry about the title." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It didn't even leave her lips. It was a practiced mask. "Oh, but dear, in a marriage, mine and thine are such ugly words. It's all ours, isn't it? Especially now that you've used the family's future security to buy it. It would be a shame if something went wrong with the filing." I watched her leave, her heels clicking with predatory precision on the hardwood. My forensic brain, the part of me that spent 40 hours a week spotting anomalies in balance sheets, was screaming. Mark wasn't just being distant, he was being coached. And the disappearance of our joint savings wasn't just market fluctuations or office restructuring. The following Saturday, Mark told me he was going to the gym. He left his phone on the charger in the kitchen, a rare oversight that felt like a gift from the universe. I didn't want to be the woman who snoops. I wanted to be the wife who trusts. No, trust is a luxury you can only afford when you aren't being hunted. I didn't check his phone. Instead, I went to his den, the small room where he kept his architectural drafts and his private filing cabinet. It was locked. Usually, I would have respected that boundary, but the memory of Ludmila's predatory smile gave me a sudden, cold surge of adrenaline. I knew where he kept the spare key, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on the top shelf. My hands were trembling so violently I nearly dropped the key. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. "Please, let me be wrong," I prayed. "Let me just be a paranoid wife." I opened the bottom drawer. It was filled with what looked like standard tax documents, but tucked at the very back was a sleek, professional folder from a law firm I didn't recognize. Volkov and Associates, Family Law and Asset Protection. I opened it, and the world simply stopped. Inside was a meticulously drafted divorce petition dated 3 months ago. 3 months. 3 months of "I love you" texts. 3 months of Sunday brunches. 3 months of him watching me pick out tiles for the new apartment. But it wasn't just the divorce. It was the statement of assets. Mark had listed my new apartment as a primary marital asset, claiming that the funds used for the purchase were commingled marital savings. He had even attached forged bank statements, crude but convincing enough for a preliminary hearing, showing transfers from our joint account into my private trust account. He was building a narrative where I was the one stealing from the marriage to hide money in real estate, and he was the victim seeking his rightful 50%. The physical reaction was violent. A wave of heat crashed over me, followed by a bone-chilling cold that made my teeth chatter. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring into a dark tunnel. My stomach surged, and I had to lean against the desk to keep from retching. I felt like I was drowning in dry land, my lungs refusing to take in air. This wasn't just a breakup, this was a calculated financial assassination. He didn't just want to leave me, he wanted to strip me of the only thing I had left of Aunt Vera. I looked at a sticky note attached to the back of the petition. It was in Ludmila's cramped, elegant handwriting. "Make sure she doesn't see the final decree until the apartment is officially registered in both names. We need that equity for the Marbella villa. Don't be soft, Markusha. She's an accountant. She'll understand the math." The math. They thought of my life, my inheritance, and my heart as a simple equation to be solved. I stood there in the silence of the room, the folder clutched to my chest, and I felt something inside me break. It wasn't my heart, that had already shattered. It was the last thread of my hesitation. The trembling in my hands stopped. The coldness didn't leave, but it settled into something hard and sharp. I took out my phone and photographed every single page, every forgery, every note, every lie. I replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, locked the drawer, and returned the key to the hollow book. When Mark returned an hour later, glowing with the sweat of a man who had no conscience, I was in the kitchen making tea. "Good workout?" I asked, my voice steady, my face a mask of wife-like serenity. "Great," he said, heading for the fridge. He didn't notice that I hadn't turned the stove on. He didn't notice that my knuckles were white as I gripped my empty mug. "I was thinking," I said, watching his back, "maybe we should have a big dinner next week. To celebrate the apartment. We can invite your mother." He turned, a flash of greed dancing in his eyes before he masked it with a smile. "That's a wonderful idea, Linechka. A real family celebration. We have so much to look forward to." "You have no idea," I whispered to the steam that wasn't there. The game had begun, but he was playing with a deck I had already marked. The evening of the celebration dinner was suffocatingly humid, the kind of night where the air feels heavy with the scent of rain that refuses to fall. I had spent 3 days in a state of hyper-focused clarity, a cold, analytical bridge between the woman I was and the woman I needed to become. I had set the table with our finest porcelain, the set Lyudmila had once sniffed at for being too modern, and prepared a meal that was a silent homage to the life I was about to incinerate. Beef Wellington, a vintage Bordeaux, and the lingering, metallic taste of adrenaline in the back of my throat. Mark arrived first, looking jubilant. He had a bounce in his step that turned my stomach. He kissed my cheek, and for the first time I felt a physical jolt of revulsion, like touching a live wire. "Everything looks incredible, Lena. Truly, a night to remember," he said, reaching for a piece of bread. Oh, it will be, I replied, my voice smooth and practiced. I invited your mother to arrive early. I thought we should discuss the finalization of the apartment before we eat. His hand paused over the breadbasket. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. The finalization? I thought everything was done. Almost everything, I said, turning back to the stove. Lyudmila arrived 5 minutes later, draped in a silk pashmina I recognized as a gift Mark had bought her using our joint credit card last month. She looked around the room with the air of a queen mother visiting a peasant village. Elena, dear, you look tired, but the house looks lovely. It's such a relief to know you'll be moving into a place that truly reflects Mark's status. We sat down, the clink of silverware against china the only sound in the room for several long minutes. The tension was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. So, I began, setting my glass down with a precise clack. I was looking through some files today. I found something curious from a firm called Volkov and Associates. Family law, asset protection. Does that ring a bell, Mark? The color drained from Mark's face so fast, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He gripped his wineglass, his knuckles turning a waxy white. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, like a deer caught in high beams. Markusha? Lyudmila prompted, her voice sharpening. She didn't have his cowardice. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. I don't know what you're talking about, Elena. Mark has been very busy with work. If he's seeking legal advice, it's surely to protect the family interests. The family interests? I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. Is that what you call forging bank statements to claim my inheritance as marital property? Is that what you call drafting a divorce petition while we were picking out curtains for a home you never intended to live in with me? I reached into my bag on the chair beside me and pulled out the folder I had prepared. I didn't hand it to them. I spread the pages across the table, covering the expensive meal with the evidence of their rot. Here is the forgery mark, I said, pointing to the doctored transfer. And here is your mother's note about the Marbella villa. Tell me, who is the villa for? Because I know it's not for me. And I know it's not just for the family. Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Lyudmila, his eyes pleading for a script, for a way out. He was paralyzed, a hollow man who had let his mother build his greed for him. Answer me, Mark, I said, my voice dropping an octave. You sat across from me every night for 3 months, knowing you were planning to leave me destitute. You let me pay for your mother's lifestyle while you were plotting to steal the only thing my aunt left me. Speak. He looked down at the table, staring at the forged bank statement. Lena, it's not what it looks like. We were worried about the future. The market is unstable. I thought if we consolidated everything. We? I cut him off. There is no we. There is you, your mother, and apparently a woman named Julia. That was the first twist. Mark's head snapped up. I did a little forensic accounting of my own on our joint credit line, I said, leaning in. I noticed the payments to a high-end maternity boutique in Marbella. I didn't think Lyudmila was planning on having another child, so I did some digging. Julia, your junior architect. She's 5 months pregnant, isn't she? The villa isn't for your mother to retire in. It's for your new family. Paid for by the equity you thought you could steal from my apartment. Lyudmila slapped the table, the wine in her glass slopping over the white cloth like a bloodstain. How dare you! You have no right to pry into Mark's professional life. He deserves a woman who supports him, not a bean counter who keeps tabs on every penny. I have every right when he uses my signature to take out a $500,000 line of credit against our current home to fund the down payment on that villa, I said, dropping the second twist. I found the loan application, Mark. You're quite good at mimicking my handwriting, but you're a terrible architect of lies. You forgot that as a forensic accountant, I noticed the smallest deviations in a curve. Mark finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, whimpering thing. Lena, please. We can talk about this. I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. My mother said, "Oh, don't blame me," Lyudmila shrieked, turning on him. "I told you to be more careful. I told you she was too smart for her own good." The mask had disintegrated. There was no more saintly mother, no more loving husband. There were only two predators snarling over a kill that had suddenly stood up and grown teeth. "You think you've won?" Lyudmila sneered at me, her face contorted with malice. "The papers are filed. The bank has the application. You can't stop the momentum of a divorce, Elena. You'll be tied up in court for years, and by the time you're done, that apartment will be sold, and the money will be in Spain. You're just a woman with a calculator. We have lawyers." "You have Volkov," I said, standing up. "I have the district attorney's office. You see, Mark, forgery isn't just a civil matter in a divorce. It's a felony. And using a forged signature to secure a federal loan? That's bank fraud." I watched as the third twist hit them. The realization that I wasn't just fighting for the apartment, I was fighting for their freedom. "I've already called the bank," I continued, my voice cold and lethal. "The loan has been flagged for fraud. And as for the divorce, I'm not contesting it. In fact, I'm speeding it up. But not on your terms, not on your timeline." Mark looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine terror in his eyes. He looked at his mother, then back at me, his lip trembling. "Lena, please, don't do this. Think of my career. Think of the baby." "I am thinking of the baby," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm thinking that the child is lucky to have at least one parent who isn't a criminal. But that parent won't be you, and that child will never see a cent of Aunt Vera's money." I walked to the door and opened it wide, the humid night air finally rushing in. "Get out, both of you. My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow morning. And Mark, don't bother going to the new apartment. The locks were changed 3 hours ago." The silence that followed the slamming of the door was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. I didn't collapse into a chair, and I didn't shed a single tear. Instead, I sat at the dining table, surrounded by the cold remains of a celebration that had turned into an autopsy, and I felt a strange, vibrating power radiating from my center. It was a cold, crystalline anger, the kind that doesn't burn you, but illuminates everything with terrifying clarity. I was no longer the wife who straightened ties and made excuses for a mother-in-law's cruelty. I was the woman who saw every cent, every decimal point, and every lie. I was Elena the auditor, and my own life was the most important account I had ever been called to settle. The next morning, I didn't go to my office. I went to a glass-walled skyscraper downtown to meet Sarah, a divorce attorney whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by her precision. I laid the folder on her desk, the forgeries, the secret loan applications, the Marbella boutique receipts, and the screenshots of Mark's statement of assets. Sarah looked through the documents for 20 minutes in absolute silence. When she finally looked up, she had a predatory smile that mirrored my own internal state. "He didn't just try to steal from you, Elena," she said, tapping a pen against the forged loan application. "He committed a series of felonies to do it. He's handed us the sword and then knelt down to show us where his neck is." The transformation was complete. For weeks, I worked with Sarah and a team of private investigators. We traced the commingled funds Mark had claimed were ours and proved they were entirely derived from my separate inheritance and my salary, which I had been using to subsidize our entire life while he funneled his earnings into an offshore account for his new family. I didn't just want a divorce, I wanted a total dismantling of the infrastructure they had built on my back. The retribution began on a Tuesday. Mark had spent the last 2 weeks sending me pathetic, alternating messages of, "I love you, let's fix this," and "You're a heartless monster who's ruining my life." He was staying in a cramped studio apartment, his mother having been forced out of her renovated dacha when the bank, alerted to the fraudulent nature of the loans used to pay for the work, froze her assets pending an investigation. The final confrontation happened in Sarah's conference room. Mark sat across from me, looking haggard and diminished. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant spark in his eyes had been replaced by a flickering, desperate fear. Lyudmila wasn't allowed in the room, but I could see her pacing like a caged animal through the frosted glass of the lobby. Sarah pushed a single document across the table. It wasn't a settlement offer. It was a confession of judgment and a waiver of all claims to any property I owned, including the new apartment. "If you sign this," Sarah said calmly, "Elena will not move forward with the criminal complaint regarding the bank fraud and the forgery. You will also agree to a lump sum repayment of the funds you diverted from your joint accounts over the last 3 years." Mark looked at the document, his hands shaking. He looked at me, his mouth opening as if to offer one last manipulative plea. "Elena, please. If I sign this, I'll have nothing. Julia, she's having the baby in 4 months. I can't lose my career. If the firm finds out about the fraud investigation, I'm finished." I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how I had ever mistaken this hollow, selfish man for a partner. "You should have thought about the baby before you decided to build his nursery with stolen money, Mark," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "You aren't losing nothing. You're losing me. And frankly, that was the only thing of value you ever had." He looked down at the paper, then back at me, waiting for some flicker of the old Elena to emerge, the one who would soften, who would forgive, who would sacrifice herself for his comfort. But that woman was dead. I met his gaze with the silence of a stone. This was the moment I had envisioned, the moment he realized that his silence was no longer a weapon he could use against me, but a prison he had built for himself. He had nothing left to say because there were no lies left that I would believe. He signed. The aftermath was swift and surgical. Mark's firm eventually invited him to resign after the bank's internal audit became public. Julia, realizing the Marbella villa was a fantasy and the wealthy architect was a man in deep debt, left him and returned to her parents' home in another city. Lyudmila was forced to sell her dacha to cover the legal fees and the restitution she owed the bank, ending up in a small, one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town. The very meager pension lifestyle she had spent years pretending to suffer through. A year later, the scent of lilies no longer reminded me of a funeral. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, the one Aunt Vera's legacy had secured for me. The sun was setting over the park, painting the tops of the trees in a brilliant, fiery orange. The air was cool and crisp, smelling of rain and the promise of a quiet evening. Inside, the apartment was a sanctuary of my own making. There were no family circles that only took. There were no whispered lies on the balcony. There was only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock and the warmth of a life built on a foundation of truth. I picked up my glass of wine and looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle like diamonds scattered on velvet. I had lost a husband, a mother-in-law, and the illusion of a perfect marriage. But in the wreckage, I had found the one thing Mark could never steal and Lyudmila could never touch. I had found myself. I took a sip of the wine, the taste rich and complex, and smiled at the darkening sky. Some people say that blood is thicker than water, but I've learned that the truth is even thicker than blood. And in the end, the only math that ever truly matters is the kind where you finally learn what you are worth.